Welcome back. African nations are holding climate talks in Maputo, Mozambique. They are expected to come up with a common position ahead of the United Nations Climate Summit COP27 in Egypt in November. The meeting is jointly organized by the United Nations, African Union, African Development Bank and the civil society organization Pan-African Climate Justice Alliance.
The talks come as the continent has grappled with devastating cyclones in the south and now faces a debilitating drought across the east and Horn of Africa. Africa, with its population of 1.2 billion people, contributes less than 4% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but suffers mightily from extreme weather events, which scientists have warned will become more frequent due to climate change. Officials are expected to decide whether to ask nations for reparations for environmental damage in Africa, known in climate circles as loss and damage. The UN estimates that African nations already spend between 2% and 9% of their national income on natural disasters linked to climate change. A Swedish diplomat speaking at the forum says adapting to climate change should be a priority for the continent. The head of climate at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa says the forum will focus on using indigenous knowledge and land practices for conservation and adaptation efforts rather than relying on external help.
We're joined now by Dr. Peter Johnson, a climate scientist at the University of Cape Town. He joins us to speak about the talks in Mozambique ahead of COP27. Now, what exactly are African nations contending with, just in terms of identifying priorities and coming up with a common position ahead of this climate summit in Egypt? Quite a lot of, particularly in the South African countries, contending with never be seen before climatic changes.
Yes, well, thank you very much. The real issue is that Africa is going to be suffering the consequences of global warming, which are really not the fault of African nations. The emissions ascribed to Africa are far less than those of the developed world, especially Europe and the United States, and of course Asia, like China. So we are seeing a situation where our climate is being affected by global warming. That is, the temperature of the planet is increasing worldwide, and certainly near the tropical regions and the subtropics, it's increasing more than the global average. So Africa is being exposed to impacts that exceed what we're going to see in other parts of the world. For example, near the tropics and the subtropics, the temperatures are going to be in the order of 4 or 5 degrees warmer than they were by the end of the century than they were in 1900. And although we've seen exceedingly high temperatures in Europe and London, those are very rare. The sort of high latitudes are not going to see the kind of temperatures that are going to threaten their livelihoods, especially things like agriculture. So we're seeing these increased temperatures throughout Africa, which are going to impact on people's livelihoods, agriculture especially, human health, disease, pests, and so on. But we're also seeing changes in the nature of rainfall. Now, rainfall is caused by many different reasons. One of them is just, for example, convection, which is stimulated by heat, but also the occurrence of tropical cyclones. We don't know exactly what tropical cyclones are going to do in the future, but we do know that they're likely to be more intense and more frequent. And that certainly is going to have an impact on the African continent. So what we're looking at is increased temperatures causing increased numbers of very hot days, increased numbers of droughts, and then also an increasing intensity of rainfall, which will lead to flooding. So all in all, we have quite a difficult challenge for the African continent.
And there's also geopolitical complications which we see are being exacerbated by the conflict in Europe, the value chain, particularly in food and fuel, has been felt very much by many developed countries, but it's across sectors. And as countries come up with the plan, a mixture of energy plans to be able to contend with this, it's been said what has been ignored are indigenous communities, particularly what activists call oil and gas destruction. We've seen it here in South Africa, the protests that have occurred particularly in the Eastern Cape. There is what's happening in Tanzania in terms of the Maasai in the Ngorongoro region and many others, Uganda. So what should we keep front of mind when we have these negotiations to balance the scales?
Yes, that's a very difficult question. I think we look at Africa as a whole. The responsibility of African countries is not so much to reduce their emissions as to be able to adapt to the consequences. Now, there are two parts to that, and one is the actual emissions. I mean, Africa definitely needs more energy. Energy drives livelihoods, it drives wealth. It's a really good thing to be able to have energy available to one. And if we in Africa are going to follow the example that went through the sort of early 1900s and the 20th century, where coal and oil were burnt extensively to produce that kind of energy, we're not really going to make any progress. In fact, we're part of the problem. So the energy issue in Africa is really going to be around renewables and looking at the opportunities that are available. Now, that means that there's have to be considerable investment in those renewables, and we know that the oil and coal industries certainly aren't necessarily in favor of that. And it's going to take investment in individual countries where we need the technology, we need the skills, and certainly the jobs may become available, and especially for those countries that are resource poor in terms of oil and gas and coal. Generally speaking, Africa's got a lot of potential in terms of renewables, and I think one has to look at that and say we're going to leverage those opportunities in order to become self-sufficient in energy. And that's going to take quite a leap from the sort of traditional way of thinking, and I think that's certainly the way that African countries are looking, and they're looking for investment in those sort of opportunities.
Now, the statements, the final statements that are adopted at these types of meetings and the political language going forward, if you're going to have a common position, say, in November in Egypt, that's also a major stickler point. We're speaking about reparations on the one hand, and then there's the issue of incentives. In the DRC, for instance, activists there are saying you can promise, particularly to the US, about $200 billion in funding for oil blocks, but we can't drink oil, we need water. So how are you also going to maneuver around that? Incentives versus reparations, given the fact that it's the indigenous communities that actually protect biodiversity.
Yeah, that's also another tricky one. If you look at Africa and DRC in particular, governance is really an issue. The indigenous communities don't have a voice. And because of the low level of democratic governance, if you like, there are certain role players that are playing a far larger role, and these role players are very much after the money. And if the money is in resources like oil and coal, then they're going to pursue that. And one can't tax sunlight and therefore wind, and therefore renewable energy is very difficult for people to make money out of as they would through coal and oil. So the geopolitics around that is very strong, and those people who are making money out of the traditional fossil fuel industry are going to be very reluctant to release that. And that's what Africa has to fight for. Africa has to turn around and say we are not going to follow the path that is unsustainable and that is pursued by sort of the traditional methods, and we're going to have to look inwards and look at our own countries and our own populations, and those indigenous people are certainly part of it. But they need to be integrated into the government, into the governance systems. Otherwise, their voices are never going to be heard. And we see that all over the world. Small indigenous populations, not necessarily sustainable. I mean, they need to move with the times. They need to get modernized. And therefore, they're going to have to adopt slightly different attitudes and ways of living in order to take advantage of the energy that becomes available. But that is a very complex process, and one doesn't know exactly how to manage that. I mean, who manages it? That's a very, very difficult question. So at COP, one is going to have to negotiate with the countries that have had the historical power and resources and say to them, look, we want to do the right thing. We want to be part of the solution, not part of the problem, and we need help. And clearly that's going to be an ethical issue. Are the rich countries going to want to help Africa in terms of sustainable development, or are they going to want to further their own profit margins? It's a very, very tricky question.
But surely in our pursuit for a just transition, there is room to using indigenous knowledge and land practices for conservation and adaptation efforts rather than just relying on just external help.
Yes, that is true, although one mustn't assume that indigenous practices are still and always will be sustainable. And many indigenous communities have been driven to the point where now their practices aren't necessarily sustainable. We look at examples of the Maasai in Kenya, for example, where politics, geopolitics, boundaries, borders, demand for land, demand for livestock has driven the Maasai into a very difficult situation where, they're not as sustainable as they used to be. So one has to look very carefully at these indigenous communities and saying, well, let's just firstly decide what is good about the way of life that you're operating or the ways that you're using, and try and extract those things that are very good, and try and deviate from the things that have become maybe not so good in the evolution of that lifestyle. Alcoholism, poverty, all sorts of things that happen around the urban areas where the Maasai have ended up now in Kenya have caused all sorts of social problems. So one can't just say that indigenous knowledge is good and other knowledge is bad. One has to look at the indigenous knowledge quite critically and saying, well, what is good out of there? And let's inflate what is good, and let's try and turn it around. Just as much as we do with scientific evidence, we need to look and say what's good and what's bad.
All right. Thank you very much for your time and sharing your insights. Climate scientist Dr. Peter Johnson speaking to us there about the talks currently underway in Mozambique ahead of the UN summit in Egypt.